Welcome to the 394th of the COVID calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. I'm coming to you live from Daejeon, South Korea. Today, I'm glad to bring writer JON MOOALEM back to COVID calls. He's the author of the book, This is Chance, The Shaking of an American City, a Voice That Held It Together. And we'll be talking in a few moments about his recent article in the New York Times. Just a reminder, you can usually catch COVID calls live on weekdays at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Just go to the COVID calls YouTube channel to watch, and you can hear COVID calls anytime, recorded as podcasts on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, or anywhere you get podcasts. You can also keep up with COVID calls via Twitter using the handle @USofDisaster or @COVID calls. Please do help spread the word and send suggestions for future guests and future topics. And as always, please feel free to suggest yourself as a future guest. Thanks to the diligent and creative work of my team at COVID Calls, we have got guests scheduled out into January and February. So please do send suggestions for future calls, and we'll go ahead and get them scheduled into the new year. As of today, December 22nd, 2021, there are 4,906 deaths from COVID-19 in South Korea. That's according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center. Okay, I'd like to turn to my conversation for today, and let me introduce my guest back for his second visit on COVID calls. JON MOOALEM is a longtime writer at large with the New York Times Magazine and a contributor to numerous other radio shows and magazines, including This American Life, The Daily, 99% Invisible, California Sunday, and Wired. He's frequently talked about his reporting on radio and television shows, including Fresh Air, Radio Lab, and the Colbert Report, and at the TED conference in Vancouver. And it's his most recent book is This is Chance, which we had the opportunity to talk about last time that he was on COVID calls. JON MOOALEM, it's great to see you again. How are you?
Okay. Thank you, Scott. I'm happy to be back.
Just to situate ourselves and maybe people who didn't hear the previous conversation when we talked, and I went back, I can't believe this was right. It was in April 14th?
That's surprising to me as well. I thought it was a lot more recently than that. I guess I've talked
Yeah,
to you not on the
we've
show,
talked since
but
then.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
but
So, I mean, it's just the sort of weird COVID time compression is doing a number on me, particularly right now. But just maybe you could remind us where you're calling from, and maybe give a little update on what the pandemic situation is there.
sure. Yeah, I live on Bainbridge Island, which is just right next to Seattle, sort of a suburb of Seattle. And what is the COVID situation? I mean, I gotta be honest. I probably don't know it in the detail that I once did. I do know that we were having an uptick in cases over the last week or so. Um, Definitely, just like everywhere else. So that it's dramatic because it's a smaller community and it's been relatively, it's not been too terribly impacted by COVID. Any uptick feels dramatic, even though it's not particularly a dramatic one. But definitely, there's a lot of I mean, at my older daughter's school, there's been a number of cases just in the days leading up to the Christmas vacation and stuff. So people are a little more on edge than they were probably a week or two ago for sure, including my own family. But it's nothing. It's still it's not dystopian conditions by any means. So we're just trying to get along.
What's the situation in the schools there? Are they able to um, track and trace, and if somebody gets sick, they keep the schools open and then isolate and so
Yeah,
that
so
you're
the public schools, I think, have done a fairly good job this fall. The school's actually out. Friday was the last day, so that was pretty good timing because um, there were a number of. It seemed like there was a case or two every day for the last few days before they left for school. But yeah, it's a pretty good system. I mean, they have the means to do. They have a free testing that's available to students and staff, and it was open I think every day that school was in session, and so that made it fairly easy to get kids tested. And then they were notifying contacts and things like that when in case. So they're pretty transparent about it. And I haven't looked too much of how I was reading your tweets about the situation there and how it was handled there. It's not quite with that intensity, but it certainly seems like it's what they're doing has made it pretty livable and safe situation. So yeah, it seems like it's as good as it can be, under these circumstances.
One of the things you and I have talked about is a local vaccination center there, which you participated in, and then I think you've done a lot of thinking about sort of the culture that emerged around that vaccination center and the life of that center, which transcended vaccination in some interesting ways. Is it back up and running for boosters?
Yeah, so we did a number of clinics. We had we were operating every weekend from pretty much a year ago until June. Once the older kids all came through, and then we stood down for a couple months, and then started up again in the fall with boosters and the younger kids, which was like a real adventure. And so we had one. I actually wasn't there last weekend. That was the first one I've missed in a while, but they did a booster clinic last weekend. They had done all the younger kids, both doses, one before Thanksgiving and one after. And I don't know what the word is if they'll be starting up again after the new year. But they also the same group runs a testing site, which is once a week. It does PCR tests. And I actually had to take a family member there on Monday. And it was interesting because I'd been there once before. I actually thought of you because it reminded me of something we had talked about. But I'd been there once before just for the purposes of travel. I needed to get a PCR test before I was part of an event. And because I've been volunteering at the clinic, I knew a number of the people who, the city employee who runs the clinic, the testing site, and some of the other volunteers. There's a lot of overlap. And but this time when I went through, I don't know if I was just imagining it, but I think with Omicron, there was a little more kind of vigilance about, roll up your window when you do the swab. And I don't remember the people wearing a face shield when they came and handed you things. It just seemed like it was a little more. And it did seem like I sort of had the realization that the infrastructure of the whole thing, it felt very grim. It felt like it could have been in a bad disaster movie or something like that. And yet it was so, because I knew the people and everyone, was, oh, hey, Laura, how you doing? And it was a kind of like a cheery, folksy atmosphere too.
Right.
And it was really eye opening to me to realize that like these things don't necessarily have to be, the tone of them doesn't have to be, I think, what we anticipate. That even in a situation where the what would be the word, like the accoutrements are dystopian, or scary, that it's like the human dimension of the whole thing doesn't really have to take on that kind of cast. So yeah, why did I start talking about this? I don't remember. I apologize.
No,
But
well, because you're filling me in on the vaccination center, but it's really
right,
interesting because it's not cinematic. I mean, that's the part of contagion that gets cut, right? It's like where then
right.
people go back to the testing site and they go back to the vaccination site. Like that doesn't fit into our sort of emergency mindset of what a disaster looks like. I mean, you're describing like a continuity.
Yeah, and I think it's also, I mean, maybe it's a matter of scale too, right? Like I wouldn't well, I don't know, maybe within like a New York City neighborhood. I mean, when I lived in New York, I didn't have a real like neighborhood ties to where I lived, but I would imagine, that maybe there are situations in big cities where on the level of a neighborhood, you do have a relationship with the people who are staffing some of these places. But yeah, I think it's just been, I don't know, I've never lived in a town this size, at least not since I was a kid.
Hmm.
And it's not really a small town, it's about 25,000 people. But yeah, I think that those sort of individual human connections really go a long way into just kind of dictating the feel of a lot of these efforts, and in addition to just their effectiveness, it's just the feel of going through them and the experience.
Just a quick reminder to folks, you're listening to COVID Calls, and I'm talking to Jon Mooalem, who was kind enough to come back to COVID Calls to talk about his new article that just appeared a couple days ago in the New York Times. It was a sort of end of year big question series. So there's a lot of great essays in this collection, and yours is titled "Is Life Better When We're Together?" And I'm just going to read a couple lines, and then we can dive into some of this. But you ask in the piece, you said it used to be a question, is life better when we're together? It used to be a question that only hermits bothered to ask. Now it's a pressing mainstream concern. Many Americans did bounce through the year ecstatic to be in a community again, but only with certain people who hadn't revealed themselves to be morons, jerkwads, or fascists. Something about passing through the ordeal of the pandemic seemed to empower people to finally write those other people off. If true cohesion is impossible, it seemed permissible to scale back the project of togetherness by drawing a cozy circle around us and a bright, flaming line between us and them. That's from Jon Mooalem's new piece in the New York Times. It's a lot to talk about here, Jon. So maybe we can start with the assignment, and what this collection is meant to do, this sort of big collection of essays in the Times. What did they want you to write about?
Yeah, so the editors, this was for the Sunday Review, portion of the opinion pages, basically. And I thought it was a really, I mean, seeing how it all turned out, I'm really impressed with the entire package, and I thought it was a really interesting way to, have a kind of year in review. Is they wanted to just, what were the debates that we were embroiled in, right, big and small. So I think there's 41 of them total, where different writers were tasked to sort of unpack or review, different arguments. And this was meant as a sort of introduction to the entire package. When they had called me and asked, and that was what they were interested in. They thought that of all the questions they were looking at, this was an undercurrent of many, if not all of them, which was, how are we basically supposed to exist in a society, right? Is it possible? And is life better when we're together? That was the exact prompt that I was given, which is insane. I mean, it's not. It's one of in my experience, like editors, that this is like, of course, the biggest possible, most unanswerable question, with the caveat that, of course, you're not supposed to come to any kind of tidy conclusion, but it's sort of a jumping off point. And so I agreed without really knowing how I was going to address that question, or like what my way in would be, and which frankly I often really don't like to do. I like to feel like I at least have an impulse for how I can meet the demands of an assignment like this.
Mm.
But it was a pretty tight timetable, so I just decided to take a leap. Um, and yeah, and actually one of the main things that I came on to first, I think I told you this when we spoke. So I should say I interviewed you for the piece, and you appear in the piece toward the end, making some
Right.
really vital contributions. But one of the things that, when I started thinking about this question in the most general terms, I started thinking about something that I had called you to talk about over the summer, which was when I was, because I was been working at this vaccination clinic, and I'd sort of seen the kind of rush of happiness and togetherness that had emerged among the volunteers. I got very interested in volunteering, like as a subject that maybe I would write about, and and specifically the idea that it really didn't seem to be exclusively, if not even mostly, about doing the good deeds. There was a dimension of um, being together with other volunteers, of the satisfaction of helping someone in the community, that was gratifying for people themselves. And at one point in our conversation, you had said, well, that's exactly how the people who are protesting vaccines probably also feel, right? The dynamics
Mm.
probably the same.
Right.
And I found that kind of jarring. So yeah, I just, with that sort of as a vague jumping off point, I got very interested in kind of what are group dynamics, like how do groups work? What are these kinds of feedback loops of, the kind of joy and euphoria of being together, and how can they they obviously provoke a lot of really wonderful human behavior, but it seems like they provoke a lot of really destructive human behavior as well. And that kind of got, one thing I've been thinking about most of the year was just, how much fun the people who were, acting in sort of overtly antisocial ways seem to be having. Um,
Right.
and that was something I could not make sense of, and I tried to unpack a little bit in the piece.
So, I mean, it starts off. I mean, the opening is tremendous, and it introduced me to somebody I wasn't aware of, which is this sort of become a famous. I mean, it sounds a little counterintuitive, but like a hermit influencer, I guess you would call him, Panta Petrovic in Serbia. Who's this?
Yeah, so he was a guy who the a French journalist had visited in August, and that was how I and others found out about him, because the story kind of ricocheted around online. But yeah, Ponta Petrovic is he's a your typical cave hermit. I'd say he lives in a a wooded area outside a small town in Serbia, in a cave in a mountain. And he was a former mechanical engineer, I believe, about 20 years ago, when he just was so repulsed by society and other people that he decided he was going to go the way of the hermit and move into this cave. And the reason why he was newsworthy was because he was coming out of his cave and down back into society in order to get a COVID vaccine.
Right.
And the reporter filmed him in this very kind of dissonant scene where this, literal caveman was rolling up his tunic to get a COVID shot, and advocating that everyone else get one too, and how wonderful it was. So yeah, that seemed just like an amusing way in, with the for two reasons. One is because even he recognized that he was connected to other people enough that he might get a disease from them, and that was unavoidable. That kind of togetherness on that level was unavoidable. And then also because just some of the comments on this story were insane. It was just the typical
Mm.
thing about people online arguing with each other and saying incredibly hateful things to one another. But it just struck me as really amusing that this had all poured out of a story about a hermit. Um,
Yeah,
so
my
yeah.
my takeaway from that was also like, once again, I don't know why I'm constantly lecturing, anti-vaxxers who don't want to hear from me. It's like even the cave guy is coming down. Like, you guys might want to take a second and think about it. I mean, there's that sort of that aspect of it as well, but it also resonated, I thought, with the kind of, so I'll speak, from my own sort of point of privilege, a person who was able to be indoors during the sort of earlier phase of the pandemic in the United States, and didn't. I'm not a healthcare worker. I'm not a sanitation worker. I was not. So I was able to be in the cave, so to speak, with my family, and so people did have a way to think about him, or the experience of isolation, that they, maybe a lot of people never had that experience in their life, where they went for a month only interacting with their family, or if they lived alone, being alone except with the Zoom call.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I mean, and even if you were not in that sort of situation, I think one thing that the pandemic did initially, especially when we didn't quite understand the science of transmission and everyone was being, incredibly vigilant on all different kinds of ways, it definitely at least made you. I mean, it concretely made other people a risk to your well-being, right? So,
Right.
um, so I think that whether that made you dislike other people or have an aversion to other people, or whether it was just a strictly a practical matter, I think it got you a little bit closer maybe to a hermit mindset, in the
Right.
sense that you saw other people as a source of friction. So yeah, I think that was yeah. I mean, especially talking to the editors at the time. I mean, they really thought, as a conceit, like this year was supposed to be the year that we all kind of came out of our caves and
Right.
back to the business of being a community. And it didn't exactly work out as well as it could have.
So then you deconstruct that, and I learned a lot from this piece. I wasn't aware of the sort of minimal group studies and the sort of psychological prehistory. I mean, it's connected to things I've studied in sort of sociology of disasters, but I wasn't aware of these. Can you say a little bit about what the minimal group studies were?
Yeah, so this came to me through a conversation with a social psychologist named Dominic Packer, who's just published a book with a colleague a month or two ago called the Power of Us, and it's all about sort of group identities and how they form. And yeah, so he referred to these as like the most important experiments in psychology. I think or maybe among the most important, but he really stressed that these were kind of landmark studies. They were done in the 50s by a psychologist named Henri Tajfel, and I may be pronouncing that wrong. I probably am. In any case, here was a guy he was a Holocaust survivor, sort of. He was fought in the war for France, but he was Polish and had lost his entire family in the Holocaust. And he really wanted to investigate how do conflicts between groups or antagonism between groups arise, intragroup conflict. But he needed a kind of baseline or control group to that, because you want to get group dynamic in its purest form, sort of outside of political matters or race or other biases. So he devised this strategy to build what he called minimal groups, which were groups that were just going to be based pretty much on nothing. He assigned them, he had them look at a couple of paintings, and he said, okay, you guys are the Paul Klee group, and you guys are the Kandinsky group, and then he had them allocate money to different people, and invariably they gave more money to their own group than the other. And there were all sorts of other experiments that followed that sort of showed how the readiness of people to be part of a group. As Dominic Packer said, when even if you just tell someone you're group A and you're group B, and it's explicitly based on nothing, that person is psyched to be in group A. They're like, oh, great, group A, it's my favorite group, and so this really, like, to me, it was a little bit frightening. I think Dom tried to spin it as like a positive thing, like we have this inbuilt readiness for solidarity, right? And that's kind of what, as a human success story, that's like a great tool that we have, that we're willing to get together in these groups and believe in those groups enough to accomplish things together. But to me, it also it was a little, I wouldn't say it's clarifying, because I wouldn't say I have a clear takeaway from it, but it certainly had a lot to do, in my mind, it seemed to have a lot to do with some of the things we've seen this year, where you kind of just get the sense it doesn't even matter what people are saying after a certain point, as long as like they're all saying it together, right? And it's saying that thing or doing that thing. It doesn't even have to make sense, so long as it is confirming their group identity, that they're part of a given group. And I think that's true on the left and the right. I mean, I think it's, I'm not trying to say it's equivalent. I think we see a lot more kind of in the far right, but it definitely, I myself, like, I feel like I will often, learn about news by seeing someone have a take on the news, right? And I think that I'm sure I'm guilty of just adopting that perspective on something that I know nothing about, and it's something I try to be careful about, but I think it's inevitable. So yeah, those experiments, they really did seem to get at something and give a kind of intellectual heft to something that I had been wondering a lot about, pretty naively and ignorantly. So I definitely wanted to write about them.
Yeah, I think it really sort of crashes two things together. One is this idea that we have that there's a sort of altruistic kind of helping aspect of human society, and that's what, pick up any world history book, and there'll be notes of that this is how society progresses. People learn how to collaborate, and you might not call it altruism. It might not be person to person, but they do things that benefit society more generally because of how they work, and the fact that they follow the rules and they don't kill each other and they join a church or whatever it may be, and the things that we could call altruism. But then you're bringing into the piece that, well, maybe just being part of the group is actually what people want to do, and that's the more important overriding thing. And you talked to psychologist Mark Snyder about about the history of volunteerism. What did you learn there?
Yeah, I mean, he basically confirmed exactly what you just said, that this idea that people are volunteering because they're saints is just it's a very unhelpful myth, right? It's unrealistic. Like, they're invariably getting a lot of very self-interested rewards from the process, and it's actually the people who embrace that and don't feel any conflict about it, it predicts that they'll keep volunteering, right? There has to be some kind of integration your kind of altruistic purpose, and then the rewards you yourself are experiencing. And a big reward, predictably, is that you are being brought into a kind of community with other volunteers, or reinforcing your ties to the community in which you're volunteering with. So there's that kind of rush of contact, right, of connectedness to these other folks, that creates this kind of feedback loop. The more you volunteer, the more connected you get, and the more connected you feel, the more you'll want to volunteer. And I identify with that 1,000%, just in my own experience volunteering at these clinics. I've met friends there. I've seen people, coming into the clinics who I haven't seen in a year, right? Who just are other community members or friends of friends or whatever it is. And I love it. It's why I keep going back, honestly, and my daughter is actually, I have a 13-year-old daughter. She actually started volunteering as well when we had the I guess I think they had to pay her, because they can't technically have her be a volunteer for some sort of legal reason. But when we were doing the younger kids vaccines, she
Oh,
and
really?
some friends started volunteering to, they have a raccoon costume, the nonprofit. So she was wearing this raccoon costume, or walking around with it, handing out, stickers and stuff. And she, on the way to the clinic one morning, we had the same conversation where she was saying, I kind of feel bad because I'm not really doing it for them. I'm doing I'm doing it for me, right? And I said, no, I think that's fine. Just keep your eye on it, because sometimes you're going to be asked to do things you don't want to do, and if you're only doing it for you, then you're not really being a team player. But there's nothing wrong with that. So, yeah, I just think it's
Mm.
I mean, it's exactly what Mark is pointing out in the piece, that that's true no matter what the aim of the volunteering is, right? Whether it's a moral thing, or a not moral thing, or whether it's a loving thing or a hateful thing, that kind of feedback loop can still be set off, where people are just feeling like they're getting deeper and deeper because they're doing this activity with other people.
So I wondered about that, too, and trying to sort of read that back through the history of the pandemic. And I've wondered, a lot of the discourse around like why the states like Florida, for example, Governor DeSantis, well, we're going to be open for business. He said, June 1st, and we're going to stay open. I mean, there's that economic argument that was out there. That's why they would reopen and leave the sort of lockdown phase behind. But I think there's a lot more going on there. And your piece made me sort of rethink that particular moment in the pandemic. That that moment of lockdown, which I think was a kind of isolating for a lot of people, and also very personal, about protecting my health and my family's health. That had run its course somehow. That there was this desire. You could even see it as a form of volunteerism or altruism, I think, to a certain degree. But people were confining themselves so that they didn't get sick, which they didn't make other people sick. But that had a shelf life, and it had expired for a lot of Americans by that point. I don't want to give Ron DeSantis any particular points of sociological insight, but I think maybe he knew something, and maybe others knew as well, that when they said, we're getting back together, we're reopening, we're allowing people to go back and live their lives, what he really meant was get back to your groups.
Yeah, and also we're doing it as we are a group, right? That now now we have a new mission,
Right.
Florida, right?
Right.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, I remember around that same time, hearing an interview with what's his name? Is it Scott Kelly, the astronaut who was
Mhm.
on
With
the
Arizona.
longest time in space? No,
Yeah.
not the senator. It's the senator's
Oh,
Mark.
oh.
Which one's the senator? Which one's the astronaut?
No,
I'm
I don't
confused.
know.
Anyway, the brother who was not the senator, who I heard him being interviewed, and he was saying, the interviewer was, the premise of the interview was, what can we learn about being in a quarantine from your experience on the space station? And he said, the most important thing is you have to have a sense of the mission, that anything is bearable, any kind of isolation is bearable if you understand why you're doing it and you're focused on the reasons for doing it. And I think that's probably plays into what you're describing too. I mean, just to kind of like idly speculate, but I mean, I would say that I think the reason why there was exhaustion was that with that with staying in was because the sort of sense of mission of it wasn't maybe reinforced enough, or it wasn't driven home enough, and eventually people just kind of flagged their stamina for it flagged. And so to come in with a new mission, right, which is now we're coming back, now we're doing that together. Yeah, I think that's, of course, that's like an incredibly powerful message.
You were talking about this in the piece, and it was sort of end up with January 6th, and you refer to I'd forgotten about him, podium guy, Adam Johnson, who I guess is in some of the videos, like literally did he take the podium from the House of Representatives and is sort of walking around the
Yeah, it
Capitol
was
building with it?
Nancy Pelosi's lectern, and he was photographed. I mean, I think it was one of the weirdest photos to come out of that whole day. But yeah, he was just photographed with it, kind of walking through, just kind of waving and seemed like he was having a good time. So,
what group does he belong to?
I mean, I don't know. What struck me about him was that, I mean, I think like a lot of the people who had gone to DC, he, the indictment. I mean, I read the indictment on him, and like other ones that I saw as well, they really documented, like, he was posting to social media all the way up on his trip up to DC from Florida, sort of like making dumb jokes, and then at the rally also, and he posed with a no trespassing sign at the Capitol, with some kind of comment like "not today" or something. It's just like very
Right.
snarky, like it was like The Hangover or something. It was just like a boys trip kind of vibe.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and I just think it's very hard. It's very hard to see those things and not just accept it. Like, okay, this guy's having like a really wonderful time, like in a way that, like, I'm not, like I'm not doing anything like that. Even when I've been part of collective actions like during the pandemic, it hasn't had that same kind of like freewheeling joyousness about it, I don't think. And so to me, that's what stuck out to me. It was just like, the carefreeness of it all, that he kind of,
Mm-hmm.
was projecting, and how dissonant that was. And then when he was sentenced, or when he was appeared in court, the judge kind of picked up on that, and really scolded him, and just saying, like, basically said, like, you have no will of your own, like you were just completely suggestible, like you believed this lie, and then you hooked up with all these people who also believe the lie, and you just kind of went along with it and did some terrible things. And so why wouldn't I put you in prison, because those people are all still out there, and so I don't know, I don't know this guy.
Yeah.
So I don't want to be unfair and use him as an example of something, but it seems to suggest that there's that the group dynamic, and that kind of feeling of belonging was probably a really powerful motivator for some people. And it's not that was the reason why anyone was there. I mean, they all had their own reasons and their own grievances, but it certainly helped. I don't think that would have happened if it hadn't been so much fun for those people. I just don't think it would have accelerated in the way that it did.
This is, like, to me, really the crux of it, and I'm just going to read another sentence from the piece, a couple sentences. You talk about, people like Podium Guy setting off, kind of running in the wrong direction, taking the wrong, taking on the wrong mission, maybe, or the wrong lessons from the pandemic. But I'm going to quote you here: "They might set off running to help in exactly the wrong direction and just keep running for months or years, as long as the disaster lasted, even if objectively their running didn't seem to accomplish very much. Or in this case, they're storming." Quoting you again: "They would be running as a group, which feels better than doing nothing alone." That has really stuck with me since I've read it and reread it a couple times. And you and I talked. I talked about my parents, my mother and my stepfather, who choose not to be vaccinated. I think, I for them as a group, I don't talk about it a lot with them, but I think there's a group identity in that for them. Neither one of them is a health official. Neither one of them stormed the Capitol. My mother sings in church choir, which really terrifies me. she's unvaccinated and she goes and vocalizes with people twice a week. And she's in baby boom generation, so to me, she shouldn't be doing that. But she's not a person who's setting public health standards for the rest of the country. So I think what I'm trying to describe here is I'm conflicted about this because she's found a group.
Yeah.
It's not the group I want her to find. But I don't think she's actively hurting anyone. And I know she's lonely. I mean, your piece has set me off into re-examining some of my
Yeah.
thoughts about this.
Well, I just think it's very hard to. I mean, I know that I've been trying to think of a good example while you're talking, but I'm sure that I've done things that are either, you know, completely silly or even, harmful to myself because I thought they were the right things, and I was getting a lot of feedback from the people around me that they were the right things. I mean, I know I've definitely worn masks in situations where I thought it was utterly ridiculous to have to wear a mask, like where the risk was, negligible. And I just did it because the people around me were doing it and
Right.
why I upset them. And, so I think that it's I guess I guess all I could really say at the end of all this reporting that I did for the piece was that it just does seem like a disaster or pandemic does create this kind of vacuum, and that I think one way that we may, it's possible that one way we deal with that is to like, put more value on what people around us are doing, right? That there's a kind of a certainty there, whether it's true or not. And a lot of it is just, luck or about who happens to be around you, right? And what messages they're getting. And if in 10 years we find out that these mRNA vaccines were terrible mistakes, I'm going to have to think about all the hours I sunk in on the weekends to put them in people's bodies, um, and uh, and then I can write a whole different story about what a how what a sucker I was. But I think it's, we can all just kind of do the best with the information that we have around us. And yeah, I just think it's there's just so much more of a premium on belonging in situations like this, because
Mhm.
it's very hard to be the contrarian when it feels like there's so much at stake, right? It's very hard to be the person who's saying, like, to the crowd that's running to escape some disaster, like, no, 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 this way, like,
Right.
all of you people are wrong. And yeah, I don't think I'd have the courage to do that, in a lot of situations.
I think people in my world of research are going to read this piece, and I wouldn't be surprised, at the next Hazard Center meeting or the next time, I don't know, whenever we'll all be together again, but that this will be discussed because there's a long trajectory in disaster social science around pro-social behavior and emergent social behavior in disaster. Is a whole literature of it. And a lot of times that literature is invoked, particularly early in disasters, to push back on this idea that society is going to fall apart at the seams. And news media, and they've gotten better, but honestly, particularly a lot of local TV stations will often stake out a camera crew at a department store so they can try to catch somebody breaking a window and looting. And they're like, see, this is what happens in disaster. People are antisocial. The worst impulses of people are brought out. Again, that cinematic impulse we were talking about earlier. And the research doesn't usually bear that out. People do tend to be altruistic and pro-social in the midst of a disaster unfolding. But I think you have asked us to rethink that in a couple of ways. One of which is that we should pay more attention to the groups that are emerging. It's not a bunch of individuals sort of reacting to the disaster and saying, I'm going to loot this or I'm going to help here. We should look instead to what the pre-existing social groupings are as an indicator of how people might react. But the other is the factor of time in all of this. And a lot of that research is looking at disasters with a really compressed time frame. And you're looking at a rangy, weird disaster that has all kinds of temporal spillover here. So, I mean, I know you didn't write this piece to try to make it into annual sociological review, but at the same time, I think that there's some ideas here that are going to be provocative to people who do, you know, a lot of research in this area around human behavior and disasters.
Yeah, that's really cool to hear. No, I have academic jealousy of of all you guys. So, yeah, no, I think the time thing is really key because like I think about like when I was working on my book about the Alaska earthquake, like there was one of the kind of clearest emergent groups was right after the quake there was a JC Penney building that was partially collapsed, and a group of people just right away started digging out this car that had been crushed by debris, and they were working together. They're bringing in tools and tow trucks and all self-organized, and they managed to rescue this woman and get her to the hospital who had been flattened in this car. And what I thought was really interesting was that in one of the interviews with one of the people who was involved in this, and then he said, and then we went there was another car and we started digging that car, and that one took even longer, and we could hear it was it was exploding, like the gas, the hoses of the engine and stuff were popping as we were digging it, and we were rushing and trying to get to it. And they finally spent all this time, they finally get to the car and they realize there's no one in it. Someone had left it running and gotten out. And so you just think that, like, that's the same exact people and the same exact techniques that had been mobilized in this one situation ended up saving a woman's life. And then mobilized in this other situation, they accomplished literally nothing and might have gotten someone killed in the process. And so I think that just always stuck with me because it sort of shows that we don't know the outcome when we're working on the project, right? We don't even really know the truth. We just are going on the information we have at that moment. But yeah, I think if you add in this time, and that's what the bit of the piece that you were reading, this idea that you could be digging out that wrong car for no reason, and then it's just going, for months, if not years, and then how warped that experience becomes, over that time, and the sort of stories or justifications you'd have to come up with to keep your group dedicated to that task when you're not getting anywhere with it. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess that's what I was saying when I said,
Yeah.
if God forbid, I have to go back and think about my vaccine volunteering in a negative light. At the moment I would never dream that I would have to do that, and I don't think it's likely, and knock on wood that I won't, because we have science and all that. But I just think the larger point is that nothing that we do is guaranteed to stand up to history, in the future. And so, any one of us can be part of some weird looking group, you know.
Yeah, I think that's that it's but I guess for me one of the real takeaways of this discussion is that, most people are not a group of like healthcare workers who are banded together as a group, and they're suffering right now greatly, but they're banded together with a mission, or they're doing it, as I heard from Cassie Alexander, who wrote You're the Nurse. They do it because frankly, it pays pretty well, and they didn't expect to be thrust into this moment of crisis, but here they are, and they're okay. So that's a group. Or the other group with podium guy, like trashing the Capitol building. The great majority of people, overwhelming majority, are somewhere in between with their other social groupings in between. And so what I'm thinking about, and hearing you talk and reading this piece, is that that's a powerful form of coping, and it could be wrong. It could be actually just not helping, or mildly like hurting. Maybe it slowed people down from getting a vaccination. That's not a good thing, but maybe they ended up getting a vaccination. They were part of a group that was skeptical, and then they went. I don't know. I mean, there's so many permutations of these groupings within the pandemic but that's where most of the coping would take place. That's my point. And
Yeah, I think that's really smart. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's, what more, I mean, yeah, I mean, that's I don't even know that I have anything to add to that. I
So,
think that's a pretty key insight, I think, as we try to make sense of what's been happening and kind of unravel some of it in the
so it's
future.
better not to be alone.
Yeah, I mean, of course, like we're maybe I'll be blundering around together, but it's you can still make plenty of bad decisions by yourself too. So, um, yeah.
What have people said about it? I mean, there's a way to read this piece and say, wait a minute, John, you're drawing a moral equivalence here to healthcare workers and Capitol stormers. It's just human behavior to be part of a group. That's a little bit of a grim takeaway. I don't know if anybody said that, but I'm creating a straw
Well, I mean,
man there.
I said I was careful to say explicitly at the end that I think it's not moral equivalence. I
Right.
think
You
that
do say that.
morality is sort of the only way we can differentiate a lot of these things ultimately, and we
Right.
have to be really really clear about that. I don't think it should be insulting to anyone to say, like, you know we're all human beings, and some of our you know basic impulses, if not like universal down to the individual, at least are pretty consistent across large numbers of people. And yeah, I don't know, it doesn't I haven't gotten any feedback like that. I've heard from some I don't know how you would characterize them. They just people did not like the piece because they thought it was dumb in a kind of blanket way. I'm not exactly sure what they're responding to, but I seem to be getting a higher proportion of those than your typical New York Times piece. Just sort of reacting out of some kind of political, um, I don't know what you would even call it. They're not in the same tribe, I guess, that I'm writing from.
Yeah.
But no, I don't know. It's only been out a day, so it's a little too soon to sum up reactions. But I don't know. I think it's I mean, if I can be perfectly honest, like I don't know if I kind of landed the plane in the piece. Like I had a lot of interesting stuff I dug up, and got some smart people like you to reflect on it. And but I don't know if there's like a clean takeaway necessarily that people can either give a thumbs up or thumbs down to, but hopefully it just kind of makes people think and maybe see some things that are happening through a slightly different lens.
Well, I think that's where, for me, as a historian, I sometimes get a little itchy when I read social psychology because it generalizes humans, and so I feel like where the open question, as it must be for this piece, is well, we got to wait and see because there's a lot of things that are unprecedented about this time.
Yeah, I
So
mean, I think it's one thing to say to generalize people's motivations, like in terms of specifics, but I don't know. Do you not think it's like credible to say like people have an impulse to form communities? Is that on that level? Is it? That's an honest
no,
question. I don't know.
um, no, I'm happy with that. I think it's just I always like the two together,
Mm-hmm.
and that's what you did, right? I mean, it's to say, okay, this is what we know when we study what human beings do. But a lot of times, unfortunately, and they think this is maybe some of the flaw in some of that pro-social work
Hmm.
of emergent behaviors, like this is what humans do. We're like, well, but humans in this particular case seem to have done something that's a little variable from that. So let's try to figure out what's happening in this particular moment that may be a fine tuning of that. I think it's the bringing of those two perspectives together
Yeah.
that's valuable. That's my point. So, and that's what again, it's like I don't think you haven't given up on the idea that humans want to get together and form groups and be volunteers, but you have to also leave space to try to understand Podium Guy and what group he's involved with.
Yeah.
That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Yeah, it was interesting, with someone you may have pointed me to her, Kate Starbird, did I learn about her from you? Yeah, so
She's a genius.
yeah, and, I spoke to her for the piece, so she's what would you call her? A data scientist
Yeah,
at the University of Washington, who and she put it really succinctly, and I was really sorry that I didn't get to talk about her work in the piece, but it ended up sort of being, like, too long of an aside. But, she's looked at, volunteerism online, right? So people who are disseminating information after disasters and things like that. And she had started studying that, and then she shifted over to studying kind of the dissemination of misinformation. And basically she said they look exactly the same, right? It's
right.
just the dynamics look exactly the same, and in some cases it's the same people. Someone who was getting information out about I don't remember what her example was. Maybe it was the earthquakes in Iran, a decade ago or whenever that was. And then you see them later, and now they're spreading but or even who's the actor she told me about? He's oh god, it's not James Caan, but it's I'm gonna think it's James Caan. He's a kind of a right wing guy on Twitter, and after the campfire in Paradise, California,
Oh.
he was getting word out about, you know, so and so, help this person find their grandma, help this, and then
Mhm.
he's also doing the same thing with you know, misinformation about voting fraud and things like that. So there you've got kind of one node in a system that
Amazing.
just depending on what he wants to type that day, he can do a, you know, something extremely pro-social or something extremely anti-social in the end.
So we're almost out of time in my discussion with John Mooalem today on COVID calls, and we've been talking a lot about his new piece out in the New York Times, "Is Life Better When We're Together?" I think we've got one level of answer to that question, certainly with more to say. Just on the way out here, John, can you give us any coming attractions? I mean, what parts of this still have your wheels spinning? What unanswered questions are you still working on out of this work?
Yeah, I mean, I think like I still really am interested in maybe writing about volunteers in general. I mean, that I ended up that got me to this piece, but that wasn't at all what this piece ended up being about. So so I don't know. Yeah, I'm thinking a lot about that, and I'm not really sure. Otherwise, I don't really want to write about the podium guys of the world anymore. But we'll
Hmm.
see.
Well,
And hermits, definitely want to write more about hermits. So
yeah, that's a tough interview, but I
yeah,
guess
yeah,
you gotta go there. But
totally. Yeah, yeah.
well, just remind everybody that you've been listening to COVID calls, and in fact, this is the last COVID calls I'm going to do of 2021. So number 394 is where we'll leave it here, and we'll pick up again in the new year, and lots of amazing guests, scientists, artists, activists, members of my family coming in January to talk to. So please do see me after Christmas and after New Year's. And I want to thank John Mooalem for your writing, for your thinking, and for taking time to talk about it here today. Thanks a million.
Yeah, thanks for doing this, Scott, and thanks for being part of the piece too.
Stay healthy, everybody. Happy holidays, and we'll see you next time on COVID Calls.